What's up, guys? Hope you're having a good day. We're back to break down all of the main card fights from a fantastic event that we've got headlined this weekend by Corey Sandhagen and Marlon Vera. This is the best event I've seen in a while, with interesting matchups from the very bottom of the card to the very top. And I'm really looking forward to taking a deep dive into each of these matchups for you from a betting perspective. Every single fight that we're going to be discussing in today's video is super interesting, and I hope you're going to get a lot of value out of the information that we're going to be going through. If you do like these breakdown videos, also want to let you know that you can watch breakdown videos for all the prelim matchups on this card over on my website, MMABettingTips.com. I'll leave a link for that in the description below. And you can look at those videos as kind of like a strategy guide where I summarize all the information that I've found in the recent matchups of both fighters competing against one another. And hopefully you can use the information in those breakdowns to make better betting decisions. They're exactly like the breakdowns that you'll get in this video on YouTube, but they're obviously for the prelim matchups. Also, as many of you guys know, I do really well live betting on the UFC. It's my bread and butter. It's something that over the years I've performed really well at, and we tend to make a profit most quarters. If you want to join live betting this weekend, I'm giving away 5 free live betting passes. I think this weekend's event is going to be really good for live betting, so I'd like to share some of that success with you guys, and you can come into the live betting group, see what I do, see how everything works, maybe learn a little bit, and I'm sure you'll enjoy it. So if you'd like to join me for live betting the fights this weekend, all you need to do is like the video, leave a comment below, and also send an email to info@mmabettingtips.com. I will leave a link, or actually I won't leave a link, it's a fucking email address. I'll leave my email address in the description below. Just send me an email and we'll get you set up with free access to live betting this weekend. Obviously I need to cap the number of people in the live betting group, because the more people that try to bet the same thing at the same time in live betting, the faster the odds decline and become suspended. So there's only 5 spaces available for this weekend, so I thought I'd give them away to you guys, and it'll go on a first come first serve basis. So email me as fast as you can, and that's like the fairest way I could think of doing it. So like I say, we make a profit most quarters. You can see the profitability chart here over the long term. Perform really well live betting UFC. It's kind of like my speciality. And yeah, we make a profit most quarters. So if you'd like to check it out this Saturday night, obviously nothing's guaranteed. We may not make a profit this Saturday, but on paper it looks like a pretty good card. So I have a feeling we'll do pretty well this weekend. And I'm looking forward to sharing some of that love with you guys. What I would say though is, and this brings me on to what I want to talk about just before the breakdowns, is that one of the biggest things that costs us money in live betting, a big percentage of our losing bets, is bad judging, right? I ran into 2 really bad decisions on last week's card when I lost money betting on Gabriel Santos and Roman Dolidze. Personally felt both those guys won those fights pretty clear. The Gabriel Santos decision was particularly bad. I don't see how you score that fight for Leroy Murphy. But anyway, a big percentage of our losses come from bad judging decisions. Which brings me on to something that I think is really important to talk about before we get into breaking down each of these matchups this weekend. Because, you know, bad judging is nothing new. It's part of the job. I'm not going to say that we're all used to it, because you'll never get used to having money stolen from you from incompetent or corrupt judges. But it's something we see most weekends, right? It's just a part of betting MMA. It's part of watching the sport. Unfortunately, judging is a real issue in MMA. And last weekend on the London card, we saw a few particularly bad decisions and particularly bad scorecards as well. And now we have an event in Texas. I don't know the best way to say this, but when you are betting on sports and you think things can't get any worse, they often do. And so in my totally anecdotal experience, I've been betting on MMA for about 14 years now. In my anecdotal experience, for whatever reason, the judging in Texas is the worst in the world. Florida, Texas is terrifying. And I don't know what it is, because even when Texas will bring in judges from other jurisdictions, like maybe a Sal D'Amato or one of those guys like a Derek Cleary that you see, judge fights all over the United States. Even when they do that, and they're not even judges from the Texas State Athletic Commission, the decisions on UFC events in Texas are consistently terrifying, to the point where they're so bad that, like, they're just inexplainable. So I wanna mention that right from the offset, because you need to be really careful with your bets this weekend. What you don't want to be doing is placing bets on, like parlays or going big on fighters who are pretty big favourites, because just like last weekend, if the fight is anywhere remotely competitive, who fucking knows how the judges are going to score it. So it doesn't matter if you called the fight perfectly, if you predicted the fight perfectly and the fight plays out exactly how you thought it would, the fight goes to a decision, ultimately who wins the fight is going to be down to the three idiots cage side at the end of the day. So, really, really important to remember that, because over the years, Texas judges have cost me like a lot of money, and I wouldn't want that to happen to you guys. So the first fight that I want to break down on this weekend's card is going to be the main event between Corey Sandhagen and Marlon Vera. Superb fight between two guys in their absolute prime, two young hungry bulls making big improvements from fight to fight, and who have really entertaining styles of fighting. So it's a fantastic main event this weekend. I'm looking forward to seeing how it plays out. And if we start off by taking a look at the odds, we can see that Sandhagen is a reasonably big favourite at average odds of around 1.59, which is going to be minus 169 for an implied probability of 63%. And if we take a look at the odds on his opponent, Vera, he is around an average of 2.45, which is going to be plus 145 for an implied probability of 41%. And I'm wondering why my camera is not focusing. Very irritating, and I will get a new camera in time for the next event because it keeps doing it. Alright, okay, so the bookies have got this roughly 60-40 in favour of Sandhagen, and I actually think the odds are quite a decent amount off here, and as a result I will be betting Corey Sandhagen this weekend. Even though he's a moderately sized favourite, I think that he wins this fight a much higher percentage of the time than that ballpark of 60%. And as a result, for all the reasons I'll explain in this video, I think he's a really good bet. So if we look at the tail of the tape, Sandhagen is 30 years old, 5'11" with a 70-inch reach. Marlon Vera, 30 years old, 5'8" with a 70.5-inch reach. So both guys the same age, same reach, but we know Sandhagen at 5'11" is one of the longest, one of the tallest bantamweights in the division, and he does a really good job of using that length. He's very good defensively, very good at staying out of a range where he can be hit, and he's very, very good at throwing long rangey strikes from positions that don't put himself in too much danger. So obviously we're going to talk about how Sandhagen and Vera match up stylistically and the reasons why I do think Sandhagen is such a good bet this weekend. But the really basic explanation is fundamentally Marlon Vera was outstruck pretty decisively, there was no... What I'm trying to say is Vera was outstruck by a pretty good margin in his last two fights against Dominic Cruz and Rob Font. Now, I know MMA math doesn't mean anything, but Corey Sandhagen is a far better striker at this stage in his career than Dominic Cruz and Rob Font. And it's not like the striking exchanges between Cruz and Vera and Font and Vera were competitive. Like, Vera kind of got outclassed against both Font and Cruz. But Vera is a tough, young, hungry bull with a granite chin who's tough as nails, that's got no quit in him, is very dangerous, and he finds ways to win. Whereas when you look at Dominic Cruz, he's 38 years old, he's on a steep decline, his body's beat up from long-term injuries, and Rob Font, 35 years old, he's going to be 36 in a couple of months. He's very old for a bantamweight. He's a little bit chinny. He can't take a shot like he used to. And so what we found in both Vera's fights against Cruz and Font is that he was outstruck pretty clear. Font and Cruz did extremely well against him. But because they're old, because they're on a decline, because Vera is so dangerous and because he's such a dog, he kept dropping them out of nowhere, which would, in the case of Cruz, result in a finish, but in the case of Font, complicate the scoring, because what you'd find is Font would like chip away at Vera and outstrike him for a wide margin throughout, many of those rounds, only then for Vera to like knock him down out of nowhere and steal the round. So the really like simplified reasoning for betting Sandhagen in this fight is that if Vera is getting comfortably outstruck by guys like Dominic Cruz and Rob Font, and we know Sandhagen is a significantly better striker at this stage in his career than both Dominic Cruz and Font, well, it's fair to assume Sandhagen will also outstruck Vera, right? If Font and Cruz could do it, you'd expect Sandhagen to be able to do it as well. And we'll go into specific things Vera does badly, specific things Sandhagen does well, which suggests this is going to be a very good fight for Sandhagen. But on top of that, we know that Sandhagen is just as tough as Vera. He's also a dog. He's tough as nails. He's got a great chin. We've seen him stand and strike and go the distance with some of the most dangerous strikers in the bantamweight division. So while it is possible Vera could knock Sandhagen down, he could knock him out. Vera can do that to anyone in the division. It only takes one shot. Vera is very, very dangerous. What we do know is that it's not that probable when you look at the guys that Sandhagen stood in front of and gone the distance with. And so Vera's in a tough spot this weekend where he's kind of been outclassed a little bit by both Font and Cruz from a technical point of view, but his youth, his toughness, his athleticism, his doggedness, his will to win, his drive has got him over the line, and they've got him the win on paper. He's found ways to get those knockdowns, right? But if you take those knockdowns out of the Cruz and Font fights, he loses a pretty one-sided decision. So I feel in order for him to beat Sandhagen, he's going to have to get the knockouts or the knockdowns against Sandhagen. He isn't going to be able to outstrike Sandhagen, and that is super unlikely when you take into consideration the fact that Sandhagen is just so much better than both Cruz and Font. So if those guys had tons of success against Marlon, reasonable for us to expect Sandhagen to do the same. So I know MMA math doesn't work, but that's like a really basic, simplified explanation as to why I think Sandhagen's a really good bet here. But now we can look at it from a technical point of view. So obviously both these guys are strikers. You'd expect this for the most part to be a stand-up fight. So let's cover grappling first of all, because that's going to be the easiest thing to cover. Now I wouldn't expect to see a whole lot of grappling in this fight. We did see Sandhagen mix things up a lot more than usual and look to both grapple and strike in his fight against Yadong Song. So I wouldn't rule out the possibility of seeing grappling in this matchup, particularly because Marlon Vera is super weak off his back. If you go and watch any of Marlon Vera's past fights, you'll see that he does tend to give up takedowns very easily, and when you do take him down, he's very, very weak off his back. He's one of these guys that doesn't really show any urgency to work his way back up to his feet. He kind of just attacks with long shot submissions off his back, like arm bars, triangles. He'll throw elbows up off his back. We were talking about how, I'm not going to say Vera got lucky against Font and Cruz, because ultimately, he landed the more damaging, impactful shots on those guys and found ways to win. But the trend of Vera struggling in fights and then just finding ways to win also goes further back than that, because if you remember his fight against Frankie Edgar, in the first 2 rounds, Edgar took him down and held him down pretty easily for decent periods of time. And then Vera was able to get a Hail Mary finish again in round 3. But again, Frankie Edgar, 40 years old, steep decline, fragile, can't take a shot like he used to. Unlikely that Vera is going to be able to get away with these Hail Mary wins against a guy in his prime like Sandhagen, compared to, guys that are pretty old for bantamweights. Cruz, Frankie, almost 40 years old. And, Rob Font, best days are definitely behind him. So Vera is very weak off his back. So while he may be a better Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu practitioner than Sandhagen, Vera definitely has a nasty submission game. You certainly wouldn't want him on your back. Certainly wouldn't want him catching you in a deep submission. But Sandhagen's probably a better MMA grappler, better takedown defense, better awareness of position, and probably better grappling control as well. Like I say, probably doesn't have the nasty submission game that Vera does, but ultimately you can't always use that submission game if your opponent puts you in a position where the submissions aren't there for you in the first place, which is why I will always favour MMA grapplers with positional awareness over MMA grapplers that go for the submission. So Sandhagen probably has the edge on the ground, and like I say, if these two are in a BJJ contest, Vera would probably do very well, but it's not a BJJ contest, it's an MMA fight, and in that instance I would give Sandhagen the advantage on the ground. Now, in terms of striking, what you'll notice about Marlon Vera is that even though he does have not a lot of knockout wins, even though he is very nasty on the feet, he's a very dangerous striker. If you spend a lot of time really observing Vera's style of striking and what his strengths and weaknesses are, you'll see that his boxing is actually quite bad, to the extent where he doesn't really throw a whole lot of punches. If you go watch his fights closely, you'll see that he very much has a kicks-based style of striking, where he will chip away at his opponents, with range-finding kicks. He'll throw flying knees. He'll look for short elbows on the inside. But in terms of actual boxing, he's not particularly good, and that's a huge problem in this matchup, because Sandhagen can do it all. He's also got the long range-finding, technical kicking game that Vera's got. He may not land with the same impactfulness. He may not be as dangerous with his kicks as Vera, but he's certainly very technical, and he certainly throws just as diverse range of kicks as Vera. But the real difference here is in Sandhagen's ability to box effectively as well, and he uses his long 5'11" frame, to stay behind his jab, to use a lot of footwork, a lot of head movement to confuse and overwhelm his opponents, and he's just a much better boxer than Vera. Another huge thing that separates these two is their ability to read their opponents. So Sandhagen is extremely good at reading his opponents. It's very difficult to catch Sandhagen with something big, because even when you land something big, he's already seen it coming and quite often moving away from it, either backing up, circling away, or deflecting it, partially blocking it, rolling with it. So it's definitely not going to be as easy to catch Sandhagen with the kind of stuff that you were catching Cruz and Font with to put him away, because Sandhagen is just very, very good defensively. In contrast, Vera is someone that doesn't read his opponents particularly well. A telltale sign that a fighter isn't particularly good at reading their opponents is when they react to a strike after it's landed. So say you see someone get punched in the face and then they kind of try to slip it or try and roll with it, and you can see they're just that their reflex is just a little bit off. Vera definitely has that problem when it comes to boxing. Not good offensively with boxing, and defensively as well, he's just not quite there. So from my perspective, when I look at this fight from a betting point of view, they're both tough as nails, they're both dangerous, they both have great cardio, they're both extremely difficult to finish, they both have issues on the ground, but strengths in different areas. And so for me, when I look at this fight, it's not that likely Vera will finish Sandhagen. If you look at Sandhagen's career so far, he's gone the distance, or he's finished Yadong Song late, he's gone the distance with P.E.N., distance with Dillashaw, he's stood in front of Marlon Moraes, stood in front of John Lineker, and you look at these names, John Lineker, big power in his hands, Marlon Moraes, back in 2010, a lot more dangerous than he is now. Big power. Yan, big power. Yadong Song, big power. Can Marlon Vera be the first guy to knock Corey Sandhagen out? If you look at Sandhagen's career, why doesn't that stop highlighting? There we go. If you look at Sandhagen's career, he lost 4 fights, but it was decision, submitted, and decision. Will Vera be the first guy to knock Sandhagen out? Maybe, but it's very improbable and not the kind of thing that I would be betting on, because it ain't that likely. You want to be betting on things that are likely. You want to be betting on things that are not likely. You want to be stacking the odds in your favour, putting your money in strong positions on things that are likely to happen a good percentage of the time. So Vera could knock Sandhagen out, very unlikely. Vera could submit Sandhagen, but you've got to put Sandhagen into a position to submit him, and Vera doesn't really have the wrestling to do that. If Sandhagen made a mistake, it can happen, but again, how likely? It's not that likely. And, can Vera win a decision here? I mean, he can, but how? He's not going to out-grapple Sandhagen. If he failed to outstrike Dominic Cruz and Rob Font, very unlikely he's going to be able to outstrike Sandhagen either. So when you look at this matchup, you see Sandhagen as a moderate favourite. And we know Vera is very good, he's very dangerous. So we look at the odds, maybe that can scare us away a little bit. But then when you research the fight, you consider all likely outcomes and pass the victory for Vera. And this is one of those matchups where, unless something crazy happens, unless we literally get like a crazy flash KO head kick for Vera, or Sandhagen slips, maybe Vera jumps on his back, chokes him out, unless something crazy like that happens, which does happen in MMA, right? But I feel in order for Vera to win, it would take like an Alexa Grasso, Valentina Shevchenko type situation where Sandhagen makes one mistake and Vera just jumps on it and capitalizes. Now Vera is very good at doing that, but again, it's one of those things that you don't want to bet on, right? When you're betting on fights, you want to bet on specific paths to victory that a fighter has. If you're betting on Vera this weekend, what you're basically hoping for is either Sandhagen getting injured, Sandhagen underperforming, or Sandhagen making a mistake that Vera can capitalize on. But ultimately, if both guys show up and perform to their full potential, Vera has virtually no way to win, no legitimate path to victory. So for that reason, Sandhagen, I think, is a really strong position to put your money. But you got to gamble responsibly. You got to do your own research. I'm not telling you what to do. These are just my opinions at the end of the day. And it's a fight between two high-level, ambitious, motivated, young, hungry bulls. And we saw in the Alexa Grasso versus Shevchenko fight, a young, hungry bull will find a way to win. So you cannot count Vera out, but we also cannot ignore this is a brutally difficult stylistic matchup for him. For that reason, I will be betting Corey Sandhagen, because I think even at these odds, there's some value there. So let's take a look at the over-under on this matchup. We can see that the over-under is in the even money odds range. Both guys are pretty dangerous, so I don't love the idea of betting on this fight to go to a decision at slight favourite odds. They're both very dangerous, so even though they're very tough, it only takes one mistake, one big shot to land and it's over. Having said that, it is a lot more likely to go to a decision. I mean, you've only got to look at their records. Sandhagen has gone to a decision and deep into the fight, in his last 3. He's been finishing low-level guys, but whenever he's been facing someone tough, well-rounded, like Dillashaw, Yan, the fight's gone deep. Similar thing with Vera, really. You look at his last, 5, 6 fights, 7 fights even. 6 of his last 7 have gone deep. 3rd round finish there, 3rd round finish there, 4th round finish there. But point being, it's not easy. It's not easy to get these guys out of there. And we know that O'Malley fight ended due to a leg injury to O'Malley. So who knows, that one could have gone the distance as well. So it is more likely this fight goes the distance, but they're both so dangerous that 25 minutes is a long time for someone not to make a mistake and get put away. So I wouldn't bet that myself, but I think it's more likely the fight goes to a decision. In terms of prop bets on this one, Sandhagen by decision is the only prop I would even consider. The odds are absolutely shockingly terrible though, at like 2.25 plus 125. That's the most likely outcome. I don't really like anything else. Those odds are terrible. I would not bet that. It's the most likely outcome, but the odds reflect that by being really short for a highly specific outcome. So, yeah, that one is a very, very easy pass for me. I hope you found that useful. Let's now break down the next fight between Holm, the preacher's daughter, and Yana Santos. Last weekend, I had to work very hard not to trip up on my words and call Veronica Hardy Veronica Mikado, and Joanne Calderwood. That's a tricky one because Wood is in both her old name and her surname. Now we've got Yana Santos, the artist formerly known as Yana Kunitskaya. So I've got to work very hard to call Yana by her proper name. Congratulations to her for getting married to Thiago Santos. And another interesting fight for us to dig into. So let's start off by taking a look at the odds on this one. We can see that Holm is a pretty big favourite at average odds of around 1.42, which is minus 238 for an implied probability of 70%. We take a look at the odds on Santos. She's around an average of 3.0, which is going to be plus 200 for an implied probability of 33%. So Holm, 41 years old, which is absolutely ancient for a bantamweight. She's 5'8" with a 69-inch reach. Santos, 33 years old, 5'8" with a 68.5-inch reach. So both roughly the same size, but there is a big difference in age, with Holm being 8 years older than Santos, which is a massive difference in age at this stage in their careers. You know, at 33 years old, Santos is no spring chicken, but 41 years old for a professional athlete in a lighter weight class, I mean, you would expect Holm to be declining significantly from fight to fight. So even though stylistically this is a really good matchup for Holm, very, very dangerous betting on fighters in their 40s, especially in the lighter weight class, especially when they're big favourites, especially when they're competing in a state like Texas, which historically has had like the worst judging I've ever seen, ever. So gotta bear that in mind. But look, stylistically, this is a very good fight for Holm. There's a reason why she's the big favourite. When you look at how these two match up skill for skill, Holm's got the advantage in every single aspect of MMA. I mean, we can go through it. When it comes to striking, you know, I've always been quite critical of Holm because she is a strange one in the sense that she is incredibly good defensively. It is so difficult to damage Holm. It is so difficult to land anything on her because her footwork is so good, her movement is so good. She reads everything, she sees everything, she's so good defensively. You know, aside from the odd highlight reel KO here and there of, you know, fighters like, you know, obviously Ronda Rousey and Betch Correia, you know, outside of those, you know, she often doesn't achieve very much with her striking because she puts defense first and doesn't like to engage. And so Holm is very good defensively with her footwork, her head movement, the way she manages the distance, but doesn't do a whole lot offensively. The problem with this fight for Santos is that she's a very low-level striker and she doesn't have any power in her hands. She's not fast, she's not technical, she's not powerful, she's quite stiff and slow. You know, we've seen her get, you know, lit up and take a lot of damage in some of her past fights. You know, it's one of those situations where Holm very rarely goes out there and absolutely puts it on her opponent, and at this stage in her career I wouldn't expect that to change. But Santos is so limited as a striker that I just don't see how Santos will be able to make this fight competitive on the feet. And because of Santos' limitations when it comes to striking, her strategy for the most part is to try and grab a hold of her opponent, drive them into the cage and beat them up in the clinch, which is interesting because obviously, you know, a lot of Holly Holm's fights over the last few years have spent a lot of time in the clinch. You think about the Jermaine Durandame fight, you know, you go back, watch a lot of these matchups, there was a lot of clinch work in them. And that's interesting because, you know, a lot of the time as fighters get older, they kind of lose that fire, lose that motivation, or lose their self-awareness in the octagon, and they start to do really strange things in fights or use really strange game plans. So we know that the clinch up against the cage is like Holly Holm's safe place. She spent a lot of time in that position in a lot of her recent fights over the last few years. And we know that's where Yana wants to fight because her grappling's not great, her striking's not great. And so you could see a situation where we do get a lot of clinch work in this matchup, and it turns out to be boring, grindy, close, competitive, an ugly fight. And in that kind of matchup, I wouldn't have any faith in the Texan judges to get the decision right. But the reason why Santos does like to battle for position in the clinch so much is because her striking is very limited and her grappling is really bad as well. She's quite stiff, so she struggles to get in on her opponent's hips and upset their balance. And Holly Holm's takedown offense, even at this point in her career, is still really, really good. So I don't see Yana having any success with her grappling at all. If this fight were to go to the ground, I think it's a lot more likely that Holly would take Yana down, because Yana's takedown offense isn't great, and Yana is also very, very weak off her back. We've seen a little bit of evolution in Holly Holm's skill set over the last few years, where she has shown more of a willingness to grapple, and I actually think if Holm did use a grappling heavy game plan in this matchup, it would be a pretty easy night's work for her, because Santos is truly quite bad on the ground. So this is one of those matchups where when you go through, you know, every area that the matchup could take place, it is a bit of a checkmate fight for Santos. She doesn't really have a path to victory. Now, that's not to say that she can't run into the worst version of Holly Holm ever. You know, fighters, they have off nights, right? Performance anxiety, maybe they fight with an injury. You know, whatever it is, you never know what version of a fighter is going to show up on fight night. And what you also know is the older a fighter gets, the more damage they take. The longer they are into their career, the more likely it is that on any given night they will just perform bad when their body or their mind starts to fail them. Holm, at 41 years old, is at that stage in her career where she can just show up overnight looking a shadow of herself. Santos is younger, healthier, hasn't taken as much damage, hasn't been in as many wars. You know, she would be well positioned to capitalize on Holly Holm showing up, you know, and significantly underperforming, which 40-year-olds do quite often. You know, you look at someone like Juliana Miller, you know, last weekend looked absolutely dreadful against Veronica Hardy. There's not the same version of Miller that we got in her debut against Brogan Walker. Looked like a completely different human being. So if fighters like Miller can look a complete shadow of themselves from one fight to the next, when she's young, she's hungry, she's improving, she's in her early 20s, someone like Miller can show up and you know, let performance anxiety or whatever the reason was for that performance get the better of her, then, you know, a 41-year-old Holly Holm, I mean, who knows how motivated she is coming into this fight or how much left she has to give. But outside of that X factor, stylistically, I do not see a path to victory for Santos here. Should be an easy night's work for Holly. So this is one of those fights that I would definitely stay away from. I think with the Texan judges, Holly's passive style of fighting at times, her age, I think there's enough risk factors there to scare me away from betting Holm in this odds range, right? It's a big price to pay. Implied probability is 70%. Those odds are fucking steep. But at the same time, similar to Marlon Vera, outside of something crazy happening, outside of your opponent not showing up and performing well, I just don't see a realistic path to victory for Santos. Therefore, even as a decent sized underdog, she doesn't interest me. Because if you're betting on Santos, you're basically gambling on the fact that something crazy will happen, and I just don't feel that is particularly a smart approach to betting. So I hope you found that useful. Let's now take a look at the over-under on this one. Obviously, both are tough as nails, both decisionators, both very rarely get finishes, so super likely this fight goes the distance. We've seen Santos in particular take tons of damage in her fights and hang in there. I mean, if you look at her fights, the majority of them go to a decision. Holly, again, the majority of her fights go to a decision. This one, very likely to go to a decision as well with how tough they are. I would not be betting on the under here, but the odds on fight to go to a decision aren't great. So, again, a particularly good deal with that either. We look at the prop bets on this one. Holly by decision is the only prop I would consider. But again, like with Sandhagen, the odds are absolutely dreadful. So for such a specific outcome, I don't feel that is a particularly good deal either. But, I'd be surprised if there are any other outcome. I will say that. It's not something I'll be betting myself. Everyone's risk tolerance is different. Maybe that bet appeals to you. I think it does win a good percentage of the time. But the odds are pretty steep for a prop. So I hope you found that useful. Now let's break down the next fight. Very interesting matchup between Austin Lingo and Nate Landwehr. Nate the Train. And I'm very critical of the UFC matchmakers. A lot of the times I feel they put a lot of fights together on cards which don't make a whole lot of sense. These fights where we can watch an entire night's card and every single fight will be very one-sided, or someone will get finished in 2 minutes. That's down to really poor matchmaking. We want those competitive, interesting matchups like the Gaethjes versus the Fizievs, or the Edwards versus the Usmans. We want those really interesting competitive matchups, the Vittoris, the Delidzes, and they're definitely delivering with this fight, because this is one of those matchups where both of them are tough as nails, both are absolute dogs, both of them are motivated, both of them are dangerous, both of them are skilled. It is such a great fight, and I'm looking forward to seeing how this one plays out. We can see that Landwehr is a decent sized favourite at average odds of around 1.45, which is minus 222 for an implied probability of 69%. If we take a look at the odds on his opponent, Lingo, he's an average of 2.75, which is going to be plus 175 for an implied probability of 36%. So Lingo is 28 years old, 5'10" with a 70-inch reach, and Landwehr is 34 years old, 5'9" with a 70.5-inch reach. So we can see both of them roughly the same size. Landwehr is a lot older, but hasn't really shown any signs of decline yet. If anything, Landwehr is getting better. So I don't think the age is too meaningful in this one. The only other X factor, or there are a couple of X factors to take into consideration. The first being that this fight was set up on relatively short notice under weird circumstances. So Lingo was supposed to be fighting on, I believe, last week's card, or if it was a very recent one. It was last week. No, it wasn't last week's card. It was the card before. But anyway, Lingo was supposed to fight a couple of weeks ago, and Ricardo Ramos missed weight. So Lingo will likely be going through his second weight cut in a short space of time this weekend. You can see this fight is at featherweight. This fight against Ramos was also scheduled at featherweight. So this will be Lingo's second tough weight cut in 2 weeks, which can often have a detrimental effect on opponents, or often have a detrimental effect on a fighter. And on top of that, Landwehr was originally scheduled to face Alex Caceres on this card, and Caceres pulled out. So this fight was only put together in the last sort of week, which could throw both guys off. And the other X factor to take into consideration is that Austin Lingo lives and trains in Texas. He's from Dallas, and so will have home advantage on his side. So if this fight is a war, knockdown, drag out, competitive fight, close fight, anything remotely close, and goes to a decision, Lingo is likely to have the crowd behind him. And speaking from experience, Texas State Athletic Commission judges are notoriously very biased towards Texan fighters. So this is one of those situations where I feel it would be quite risky to bet Landwehr this weekend, because it won't be easy for him to finish Lingo with how tough Lingo is. It won't be easy for him to win a decision against a Texan in Texas. So just a couple of things to bear in mind. If you feel really confident in Landwehr, just know he really has to go out there and put it on Lingo in order to likely win a decision. Home advantage doesn't always come into play, but it's foolish for us to completely disregard it, because we know it's a factor. We saw it last weekend with Leroy Murphy beating Gabriel Santos, when pretty much every single person that watched that fight scored the fight for Santos. So we know home advantage is a thing in MMA judging. We haven't seen it a whole lot in the last couple of years since COVID hit, because the majority of events have been in Vegas, where hometown advantage ain't really a thing. But as the UFC do more events now around the world, on the road, and the different jurisdictions, it's going to be something we'll have to talk about a lot more. Lingo, home advantage on his side in Texas, is a big deal, speaking from experience. So in terms of how these two match up from a stylistic point of view, the weakness of both guys is definitely their grappling. Neither guy has got particularly good takedown defense or a particularly good ground game. However, Landwehr has evolved in recent fights over the last sort of couple of years to mix things up a lot more. If we just go back sort of 3 or 4 years, Landwehr was more of a Nate Diaz style brawler that would just kind of come forward, look to break his opponents with pressure, and just look to drag him into a brawl. We've seen him fight a lot smarter in recent fights over the last sort of 2 years, where he's came in with specific game plans and strategies tailored towards causing his opponents problems. So we saw him wear Ludwig Klein down in the clinch. We've seen him mix things up with some grappling against David Onama. And so even though both these guys are pretty bad on the ground, out of the two, you never really see Lingo try to take his opponents down. You do see Landwehr try to take his opponents down from time to time to mix things up and throw them off. So you'd have to give the advantage when it comes to grappling to Landwehr, just because he's more likely to use grappling. So I guess that means he's got more weapons coming into this matchup, whereas Lingo's probably just going to look to stand and box. I mean, Lingo doesn't even really throw that many kicks. He's more of just a puncher, really. So Landwehr's got grappling on his side for sure. Now, in terms of striking, it's a real difference in styles, where Landwehr is dangerous on the feet, don't get me wrong. He is dangerous, he is aggressive, he can hurt you. But for me, Lingo, even though he may not have necessarily shown it in the UFC so far, is a much more dangerous striker than Landwehr in terms of power. We haven't seen Lingo look all that dangerous in the UFC, but if you look at his nickname, Lights Out, and if you go and check out his fights before he came to the UFC, notice that he's got a lot of first round knockouts. Now granted, these were knockout wins against very low level opponents. I do get that. But when you go and watch these fights, you go check them out yourself. Lingo's one of those dudes that you can just see when he connects, he has major, major power. Lingo's one of these guys that when he lands clean and hard on people, they just have a look in their eyes like, I can't believe you fucking hit that hard. Like, like someone like a Nico Price, they just have that heaviness, that clunkiness to everything that they throw. And Lingo's definitely got that, which is notable to me in this fight, because one of Landwehr's biggest weaknesses is his striking defense. He loves the brawl, he loves the scrap, he loves the throw down, he loves to get dragged into wars. And because of that, he puts himself in a lot of danger. He's very easy to hit. He does take a lot of damage. He does eat clean, hard shots. We saw his fight against Darren Elkins. We all know, Darren Elkins is a very low-level striker, no real power in his hands. And yet, Landwehr looked like he'd been in a car crash after that fight. He took so much damage. Now, admittedly, big part of that was probably down to the fact that he was facing Darren Elkins, and he knew maybe Elkins didn't really have the power to hurt him. We saw him fight much safer, much smarter against a more dangerous striker like Ludwig Klein. However, he is still there to be hit, and Lingo hits extremely hard. So this is one of those matchups where, for me, there's way too many risk factors to even consider betting Landwehr, because Lingo's got home advantage on his side. Lingo's not going to be as easy to take down and hold down as some of the recent opponents Landwehr has faced, who, he has been able to out-hustle a lot easier on the ground than in the clinch. And on top of that, Lingo's power is a great equaliser. So while he may not be able to match the volume, the output, the work rate of Landwehr, I wouldn't be at all surprised to see Lingo knock Landwehr out or drop him a couple times. So for me, this fight is definitely dog or pass. When you look at the odds, one of those matchups where you've got to let the odds do the work for you. In Texas, against a popular hometown guy with power in his hands, tough, gritty, determined, you'd have to be crazy to bet Landwehr in this odds range. The risk to reward is just not good. So Lingo is a very tempting bet this weekend, and I haven't decided whether I'm going to bet Lingo yet myself. The problem that I've got with this card is that I think there are a lot of underdogs who have a decent chance of winning. The problem with almost all of them is that they're all flawed. So obviously a couple of weeks ago, I recommended a bet on a really good underdog on Jonathan Martinez to beat Said Nurmagomedov, and we were able to bet Jonathan Martinez at odds of 3.0 plus 200. But a big part of the reason for me betting on Martinez was because I actually felt it was quite likely he would win, in terms of, we didn't need the randomness of MMA. We didn't need something crazy happening to get lucky. We knew that Nurmagomedov would likely slow down as the fight wore on, and Martinez has got great cardio, so he would likely do better in the second half of the fight. We also knew Martinez would likely outstrike Nurmagomedov pretty comfortably once Nurmagomedov got tired. So Martinez was a super strong position. The problem with a lot of the underdogs on this card is that their opponents do a lot which can cause them big problems. That wasn't really the case with Martinez, because even though we knew Nurmagomedov had an advantage on the ground, we also knew Nurmagomedov didn't have the gas tank to fully execute that and make the most of it with a grappling heavy game plan for 3 rounds without gassing himself out. When you look at a fight like Lingo versus Landwehr, ultimately Landwehr could out-hustle Lingo by wet blanketing him in the clinch, spamming takedowns, and outworking him on the feet. It can happen, So it's one of those situations where Lingo's very tempting, but I like to find those spots where I identify an underdog which I actually believe is the better fighter and is more likely to win. Another example, recently recommended a bet on Tommy Fury to beat Jake Paul. It's because when I did the fight research, I was like, holy shit, Tommy Fury is the better boxer, and he's an underdog. This is a no-brainer. I'm not as big of a fan of betting underdogs in situations where they do need a bit of help from the universe to get the job done, either by, in this case, Lingo landing a big shot and knocking Landwehr out, or the judges giving him the nod and the hometown decision. So I am very tempted to bet Lingo this weekend. Haven't made my mind up yet. Obviously, if you are a member of my community, I'll put a Telegram message out, notifying you if I do decide to bet Lingo. But for now, I need to give this one some more thought. He's very tempting. And I just need to give it some more thought, man. That's all it is. Need to sit on this one and look at the weigh-ins and give it some thought. So in terms of the over/under on this one, we can see that fight goes with decision is the least likely outcome in the eyes of the bookies, and fight doesn't go to decision. The odds are quite steep. So what I would say about this one is, I do understand why the bookies have got it as more likely for the fight not to go to a decision, because both of them are tough as nails, both go for the kill, both of them are dangerous. However, I feel the likelihood of this fight ending inside the distance is baked into the odds. I think this is one of those situations where fight goes to a decision is the better risk to reward ratio, purely because both these guys are quite comfortable in the chaos. They are both dangerous, for sure, but they're also both quite difficult to put away. You look at Lingo. He's been in 3 wars in his first 3 fights in the UFC so far. They've all gone to a decision. You look at Landwehr. And if we highlight his fights in the UFC, we can see that 1, 2, 3, we can kind of throw this one in as well as it finished late. But 4 of his last 6 have gone to a decision. He's been finished twice. And from my perspective, Lingo's just as tough as guys like David Onama, Ludwig Klein, Darren Elkins. So if those guys can go the distance with Nate, Lingo probably can as well. We've seen Landwehr knocked out, KO dead by Erosa, KO dead by Burns. I'd argue Lingo has got a lot more power in his hands than both Burns and Erosa. Admittedly, it was a knee that ended Landwehr's nights against Erosa and Burns. But I would say that, in terms of raw power and knockout ability, Lingo's a lot more dangerous than both Erosa and Burns. So, Lingo definitely get a finish here. But I think both are tough. Both are difficult to put away. Betting on the fight to go to a decision based purely on their toughness is probably going to give you the better risk to reward ratio. Because of how dangerous Lingo is, I'm not going to be betting that myself. But if you really want to gamble on the over-under to make watching the fight more interesting, the odds on that are dreadful. Those in themselves would force me to take the over on this one. Now, in terms of prop bets, I would go for Lingo to win by knockout or TKO. The odds are 4.75 plus 375. And not a bad prop. Like I say, Landwehr is very bad defensively. Lingo hits very hard. Wouldn't be surprised if Lingo adds Landwehr to the highlight reel. Not a bad bet, actually. What's Lingo by decision? 7.0. See, I don't mind that either because Lingo has home advantage on his side. Landwehr might really have to put it on Lingo to win a decision against the hometown guy. Thing is, Landwehr kind of does put it on guys that's like his thing. He's crazy aggressive, fights at a high pace. So I don't know, man. I don't know. I quite like knockout and I like decision, but you can't really bet both those props because losing one or the other cuts the odds in half. So you'd be better off just betting Lingo straight as the underdog. So I guess you gotta make your own decision on that. If you do want to bet a prop on this fight, do your own research and and decide for yourself whether you prefer to take the knockout or TKO or the decision. I'm split on it. I'm torn. I'm not too sure. It's a tough one for me. So I hope you found that breakdown useful. Now let's break down another very interesting fight on this card. This time we're going to be talking about Macy Barber versus Andrea KGB Lee. God, is she still using that nickname? Dreadful. Anyway, Macy Barber is a pretty big favourite at average odds of around, call it 1.36, which is going to be minus 278 for an implied probability of 74%. We take a look at the odds on her opponent, Andrea KGB. She's around an average of 3.25, which is going to be plus 225 for an implied probability of 31%. So Lee is 34 years old, 5'6" with a 69.5-inch reach. And Macy Barber, 24 years old, 5'5" with a 65.5-inch reach. So we can see both of them roughly the same size, but Lee has got a 4.5-inch reach advantage, which is pretty notable because Barber's striking is quite bad. She's quite bad defensively, and Lee obviously has a base in Muay Thai. She doesn't do a particularly good job of using the reach, but better to have a 4-inch reach advantage over someone that's a bad striker than not. Both of them roughly the same height. Big difference in age, 10-year age gap in this fight, and we know statistically the younger fighter wins around 70% of the time when there's a 10-year age gap in a fight. Now Lee at 34 years old, she's only just turned 34, but at 34 years old, she is quite old for a flyweight. The lighter weight classes, do tend to see fighters decline earlier in their career. So 34 years old is quite old for a flyweight. Having said that, I can't necessarily say Lee is declining. What we do know about Lee is that she's like a box of chocolates. The To quote Forrest Gump, you never know what you're going to get from her. She's very inconsistent. Sometimes she shows up looking like world champion material. Other times she shows up looking like a total bum. I don't know what it is with Lee, but throughout her career, really, she's been incredibly inconsistent. We'll talk about the specifics around that shortly. And so it's difficult to gauge whether Lee is declining or not. What we do know, her last performance against Viviane Araújo was truly horrendous, where she knocked Araújo down in like the first minute and adrenaline dumped and was gassed out of her mind after 3-4 minutes. But then the fights before that against Cynthia Calvillo and Antonina Shevchenko, she put in some of the best performances of her career, and there were signs that she was turning a corner and really starting to improve. And so you never know what you're going to get with Lee, a very, very unpredictable fighter. But fortunately, because there's so much footage available on her against such a diverse style of opponent, we know a lot about Lee's strengths and weaknesses, which give us a lot to work with in trying to assess this fight from a betting point of view. So where do we begin? There is one more X factor I forgot to mention. How could I forget? How could I forget? We've all seen Andrea Lee walk into the octagon in her cowboy hat, cowgirl hat. I'm guessing it's a cowgirl hat. Is that the correct description of her headwear? Cowgirl hat. She wears it to the weigh-ins. She wears it to the octagon, and she is from Atlanta, Texas. So Andrea Lee is going to have the crowd on her side in a big way. She's positioned right in the middle of the main card. The crowd are going to be hyped up. The crowd are going to be litty. The arena is going to be bouncing. And Andrea Lee, a popular fighter with an exciting style, walks out rocking the cowgirl hat. She's going to have the crowd behind her in a big way. So needless to say, home advantage for Lee this weekend could be big. Really, really, really big. And as a result, Macy Barber is going to have to really do big things to win a decision against Andrea Lee in Texas, which historically she has not been great at doing. You know, we've seen her put in very passive, very weird, very tentative performances against Miranda Maverick, also kind of passive and tentative against Jessica Ai as well. You know, Barber's been one of these fighters that has kind of been very passive, tentative, hasn't done a lot in her fights, but at times still picked up the win. If she's passive and tentative in this matchup and this fight turns out to be close, there is very unlikely that the Barber is going to be able to win a decision in Texas against someone like Andrea Lee wearing a motherfucking cowgirl hat to the octagon. Like, it's not that likely, right? It ain't happening. So Barber really, really needs to be at her best this weekend. So the problem when we break down Andrea Lee's fights is, again, she's like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get. You never know what version of her is going to show up. You're going to get the version of Andrea Lee that looks strong and physically imposing on the ground and shows a lot of urgency to scramble back up to her feet when she gets taken down. Or you're going to see the version of Andrea Lee that gives up cheap takedowns and just kind of lies on her back looking kind of hopeless. You're going to see the version of Andrea Lee that can go to war and fight at a high pace for 3 rounds. Or you're going to see the version of Andrea Lee that gasses out after round 1 and looks incredibly sloppy in rounds 2 and 3. You're going to see the version of Andrea Lee that looks fast and technical and lands mean, nasty, impactful shots on the feet, like what we saw from her when she took on Montana De La Rosa. Or you're going to see the very flat, sloppy, poor defensively version of Andrea Lee that turned up against Lauren Murphy. Problem with Andrea Lee is that there's no pattern, there's no rhyme or reason or logic that enables us to predict what version of Lee will show up. On her day, we know she's very good. On her day, we know she's one of the best flyweights in the division. When she's good, she's very fucking good. When she's bad, she's very fucking bad. And unfortunately, there's just no way to know what you're going to get from her. And there's 2 ways to look at it this weekend, right? We could say, you know, the crowd will give her a lift. The crowd are going to motivate her in her home state of Texas. She's going to want to go out there, put on a show, entertain the fans. That's one way to look at it. Maybe she looks great, being fueled by the energy of the audience, the crowd. But on the other side, you could go, well, maybe the pressure of fighting in Texas gets the better of her, and maybe performance anxiety makes it really difficult for her to perform to her full potential. We hear about Derek Lewis talking about how difficult he finds it performing in Texas in front of fans that give him a lot of love and support. So maybe Lee suffers in that way. It's difficult to say. So what I'm going to do as we break down this matchup stylistically is cover how the fight is going to play out with the good version of Lee or the bad version of Lee. And that'll help you understand the complexity of betting a matchup like this. So, on the feet, Maycee Barber is one of these fighters that is very green. So because she doesn't have a whole lot of confidence in her striking, she only really fights in two ranges. She likes to be all the way outside of a range where she can be hit, bouncing around, doing a whole lot of nothing, like we saw in the Miranda Maverick fight, where there were just long periods of nothing happening because Barber would just bounce around on the outside and not engage. Or Barber wants to be blitzing forward, biting down on her mouthpiece with big explosive combinations that often result in her driving her opponent into the cage and working for a takedown from the clinch. So those are kind of the two different modes that you see from Barber on the feet, and you don't see a whole lot else. Historically, even I guess when Lee's been at her best, she's never really been the best at landing on opponents that won't stand in front of her. So Lee is at her best when she can stand in front of her opponent like this, in rock'em sock'em robot range, and just throw down in a phone booth. That's when Lee's at her best. Lee's not particularly good at cutting the cage off and landing clean, hard, impactful shots on fighters who don't stand in front of her and engage, which Barber generally doesn't. So I do think Barber's style can frustrate Lee. Having said that, if Lee is aggressive, if Lee starts walking Barber down, and if Lee starts letting her hands go, Barber is so bad defensively that Lee will have a decent amount of success with her striking. Now, Lee's problem is that she's game and loves a scrap. You know, last weekend we were talking about how Joanne Wood is just one of these fighters that just loves to throw down, and how she started fighting when there wasn't even women's MMA. Andrea Lee's the same. She loves a scrap. She loves to throw down. She loves a war. And as a result, she's not the best defensively because she's so up for an exchange. She's so up for standing and banging that she's there to be hit. And so I could actually see Barber having a decent amount of success with that blitzing style, because when she's on the outside, I think Lee's going to struggle to cut the cage off and get to her. And when Barber starts to come inside and let her hands go, Lee's not going to be looking to play the same game and back up and slip shots like Barber does. She's going to be looking to stand her ground and fire back. And in those exchanges, she is prone to getting caught. So on the feet, because of how awkward Barber's style is, you could see her have some success here. But if Lee is aggressive, walks Barber down, you know, Lee is the far more skilled striker out of the two. There's no doubt about that. Now, when it comes to grappling, this fight is so interesting because there's so many layers to it. So, right off the bat, both of them have really bad takedown defense. The real difference between these two, though, is that when Lee is fresh and motivated, she's virtually impossible to hold down. Andrea Lee's one of these fighters that when you take her down, she just pops back to her feet like a spring. She's very, very difficult to hold down. Easy to take down. Her takedown offense is dreadful, but very difficult to hold down. Barber is harder to take down than Lee, but much easier to hold down. Barber is super weak off her back. If you put Barber on her back, you can hold her down pretty easy. And Lee does have a pretty heavy top game. She's a pretty skilled grappler. The problem with Lee is that one of the reasons why she's so difficult to hold down is because of how strong and athletic she is. I mean, look at her in this picture. Big old muscles, big athletic frame. And so when these smaller, slight, feminine opponents like Maycee Barber that don't have that same physicality or muscular frame take her down, she just overpowers them and stands back up. But the problem is, and we talk about this every week, that abnormal physicality, athleticism, those big muscular frames often come at a cost. And Andrea Lee relies so much on her physicality and strength to work out of bad positions on the ground that she does slow down very quickly. And so while Andrea Lee is virtually impossible to hold down early in a fight, if you keep taking her down, by midway through the second, it becomes a lot easier to hold her down. And because her takedown defense is bad, no matter how fresh she is, when she starts to get tired, it's very easy to get her down and control her on the ground. What's interesting about that, though, is that in order to wear Andrea Lee down, you usually have to make her work decently hard. Like, not crazy hard, because her cardio generally isn't great. You do have to make her work decently hard. And I don't think Barber's going to be able to do that on the feet, because Barber doesn't like to engage. So it's not like Lee is going to be exerting loads of energy and big exchanges and stuff on the feet. And Barber doesn't really have the kind of persistent grappling that tends to cause Lee or someone like Lee a problem. Barber does like to work in the clinch a little bit up against the cage, but it's not like you'll see, Dagestan type chain wrestling from Barber, right? Barber, for whatever reason, is quite stiff, quite rigid, and she does struggle to get in deep on the hips and legs of her opponent, which makes it more difficult for her to get takedowns. Now, every time I break down a Macy Barber fight, I'm like, she's got a lot of good foundations to become a really good fighter, but she's really lacking offensive wrestling. She just can't get her opponents down. And that might really cost her here, because in order to have a lot of success with grappling against someone like Lee that's difficult to hold down, generally speaking, you need to persistently grapple and grapple a lot to wear them down to the point where they're then too tired to defend the takedowns and too tired to work their way back up to their feet. Barber doesn't really have that type of grappling. She's more of a single shot grappler, where she'll attempt a takedown. If she doesn't get it, she'll kind of retreat on it and not really persist and drive through and hustle to complete the takedowns. So from that respect, it is not a bad stylistic matchup from Lee, because she's got the edge on the feet and at the same time is pretty good at defending herself against the kind of grappling Barber brings to the table. The problem with Lee is that she's prone to just putting in pretty horrendous performances. We spoke earlier on about how, Juliana Miller last weekend showed up and looked an absolute shadow of herself compared to her UFC debut against Brogan Walker. And that's out of character for someone like Miller that, looked so aggressive, so hungry, so strong coming up to the Ultimate Fighter. But with someone like Lee, we've kind of come to expect the unexpected. In her last fight against Viviane Araujo, she adrenaline dumped and gassed out after 3-4 minutes, when in her previous 2 fights she fought at a high pace and kind of broke Shevchenko and Calvillo with the pace that she fought at. So very difficult to know what to get from her, or what you're going to get from her. What I would say is, if the best version of Macy Barber showed up and the best version of Andrea Lee showed up, I think Andrea Lee would win this fight pretty comfortably, because I think she'd be able to outstrike Barber on the feet, and I think she'd be able to neutralise a lot of the threats that Barber poses to her with grappling. The problem with Lee is it's always kind of 50-50 what version of her is going to show up, and that makes it very difficult to bet her fights. It's difficult to bet Barber, because if she runs into the best version of Lee, we know she's screwed. But it's difficult to bet Lee, because we know on any given night she might just not turn up and completely set fire to your money. So it's one of those situations where it's a risky fight to bet. Mind that it's dog or pass. You'd have to be truly, truly insane to bet Barber at these odds, because not only do we know that if the best version of Lee shows up, she's going to give Barber hell from a stylistic point of view, but we also know that Andrea Lee is going to be walking to a cage in Texas for a cage fight wearing a fucking cowgirl hat. And we know that home advantage is a big deal in Texas. So it would be very foolish to bet Barber at big favourite odds. especially with how passive and tentative Barber's been in some of her recent matchups that have gone the distance, where she has failed to put her stamp on rounds. I think if these rounds are remotely close, the judges will probably give Lee the nod, and hometown advantage will make it difficult for Barber to win a decision. She's really going to have to go out there and properly put it on Lee, which is historically something Barber's not particularly good at doing. So there's no doubt that this fight is dog or pass. And I won't lie to you, I am very, very, very tempted to bet on Andrea Lee. The problem I've got is it's one of those fights where you'll either look like a genius or an idiot. If you bet on Andrea Lee this weekend and she comes out, puts on a striking clinic, neutralizes a threat of Barber's grappling, in the same way she did to Cynthia Calvillo, she will look like an obvious bet. She'll have made it look easy, and you'll look very smart because you took Lee as a big underdog and she made it look very easy. The problem is, a just as likely outcome is Andrea Lee shows up like she did in her last fight against, Vivian Araujo, gets caught by the blitzing attacks of Barber on the feet, gets worn down in the clinch, and is too gassed out of her mind in rounds 2 and 3 to have any success at all. And then if you bet Andrea Lee, you're a clueless idiot, you're a fraud, you're a scammer, you're an idiot that doesn't know anything about MMA. How could you have possibly bet Andrea Lee? She looked terrible. And we often find ourselves in these positions in MMA where there are two reasonably likely outcomes that are polar opposites of one another. We were recently talking about the Cyril Gane fight and the John Jones fight. I lean towards Cyril Gane in that matchup because from my perspective, it's very rare that you see a fighter come back from a 2-3 year layoff in their mid-30s and look good. It's very, very unlikely. The trend was not in John Jones's favour. Guys that mess around with drugs and alcohol and have domestic violence issues and kind of go off the rails and maybe build a career off PEDs and then suddenly come back after a long layoff, they usually look absolutely fucking terrible. So with Cyril Gane being young, hungry, up and coming bull, I played that trend, and I didn't bet Cyril Gane, but I leaned towards him in that fight. And then obviously John Jones made it look easy. He submitted Gane very quickly. And people would say to me, you're a fool for leaning towards Gane. It was so obvious John was going to do that. And I'm like, well, easy to say that. But if John would have shown up looking like a fucking drug addict that had been on the shelf for 2-3 years in his first fight in a new weight class, after domestic violence issues and alcohol issues and performance enhancing drug issues, there would have been people that come out and criticised others and like, how could you possibly have given John any chance? Clearly he was going to look at, show up and look terrible compared to how he used to. So we often find ourselves in fights like this where it's impossible to lean one way or the other with any amount of confidence because we don't know which way the fight is going to go. There's two very clear ways in which this matchup could go, but impossible to gauge which way it will go. And so whenever you've got a situation like that, I always say let the odds do the work for you. Reason why I leaned towards Gane in that matchup was because Gane was the underdog. So with so much uncertainty in two ways it could go, I leaned Gane. Didn't think Gane was more likely to win. I just know the odds gave you the better risk to reward ratio. And it's exactly the same situation here. I don't know who's more likely to win this fight. But what I do know is that Lee gives you the better risk to reward ratio. Because there are a lot of ways she can win this. And when you don't have a confident lean either way, just let the odds do the work for you. Go with the underdog. It's as simple as that. I don't really have a lean in this fight. I think the odds should be closer to even money than they are, based on the fact that Lee may or may not show up. However, it's very difficult betting on Andrea Lee. It's one of those things where I am very tempted to bet Lee, and I might bet her. And if you're a member of my community, I will message you on Telegram if I do decide to bet Lee. She is super tempting, but it doesn't mean it. You can't pay your bills with mortgage. You can't pay your mortgage with value, right? And ultimately, if Lee just doesn't show up on Saturday night and puts in another horrendous performance like she did against Araujo, she's probably going to get out-hustled, outworked, and beaten pretty decisively. And so I hate putting my money in situations like that where a fighter just may decide on the day not to fight for your money. It's just frustrating. It's just frustrating. It's like Juliana Miller last weekend against Veronica Hardy. That's not Miller at her best. That's not Miller anywhere near her best. We know she's capable of so much more than that. Just didn't show it. And when it happens with fighters like Miller, it's a surprise. It's come out of nowhere. But when it happens with someone like Lee, we've come to expect it because we've seen it happen so many times in the past. So whenever you bet on someone like Lee, it's a big risk. But the odds aren't bad. So is the risk worth the reward? I'm not so sure. I haven't made my mind up yet. Let me know what you think in the comments below. So in terms of this going to a decision or not, both fighters, super tough. Very likely to go to a decision. The odds are pretty steep, but I would be surprised if this one ended inside the distance. Even when Andrea Lee gas is very bad, she's still tough as nails and difficult to put away. We've seen she's lost 6 times in her career, but she's only ever been finished once in around 20 pro fights, and that was a very long time ago as well, when she was pretty much just a kickboxer and didn't have any grappling at all. Much more difficult to submit Lee now, even when she gets very tired. So not easy to submit Andrea Lee. And if you look at Barber's record, she's also pretty tough as well, also building a reputation for being a bit of a decisionator. So the odds on the fight to go to decision are pretty steep. They don't get me interested, but I would be very surprised if this one were to end inside the distance. In terms of props, I quite like Lee by decision. Odds of 4.50 plus 350. Hometown judging. I think the best version of Lee gives Barber absolute hell. So yeah, that would be the prop I would go for, Lee by decision. So I hope you found that breakdown useful. Now let's break down the next fight on this card, which is going to be Alex Perez against Manel Kape. So let's start off by taking a look at the odds on this one. So Kape is a moderately sized favourite. The odds are around 1.57, which is going to be minus 175 for an implied probability of 64%. We take a look at the odds on Alex Perez. He is around an average of 2.50, which is plus 150 for an implied probability of 40%. So Perez is 31 years old, 5'6" with a 65.5 inch reach. And Kape, 29 years old, 5'5" with a 68 inch reach. So you can see Kape, slightly longer reach, and both guys roughly the same age. So this is a really clear-cut fight in terms of how it's likely to go. It's not easy to predict the outcome, but there are only really 2 ways that I see this fight going, and from that respect, it's a pretty clear-cut matchup. It's a classic striker versus grappler matchup. If the fight stays standing, Kape is going to do very well and cause Perez big problems, I would imagine. If the fight goes to the ground, I would imagine Perez does really, really well. And this fight is going to come down to, in my opinion, where Perez is at in his career mentally. So we've seen Perez kind of break and cave in fights pretty easily in the past. He's one of these guys that can be broken. If you put him in a bad position, he'll look for a way out. And so while this is a very good stylistic matchup for Perez, what I've found, I've talked a lot about my experience in this video, or in these breakdown videos this week, where I've talked a lot about my anecdotal experience of judging in Texas. And now I want to talk a little bit about my anecdotal experience of dealing with fighters who can be broken, right? So we've seen Perez, kind of look for a way out in some of his past fights. The Joseph Benavidez fight in particular was very, very strange. And generally what you find is when a fighter who can be broken and looks for a way out goes up against someone that is really tough with no quitting them, who's just aggressive and mean and nasty, the guy that's tough and aggressive and mean and nasty almost always wins. And it doesn't really matter how the 2 guys match up stylistically. The tougher dude just finds a way to break the other dude, and that ends up being the deciding factor in the matchup. So this fight's a really strange one, because stylistically, if Perez is at his absolute best this weekend, if Perez shows up and performs to the level that we know he's capable of, I don't really give Manel Kape much of a chance. This is a terrible, terrible, terrible stylistic matchup for Kape, because he has no takedown defense and his ground game is actually a joke. Like, Kape's pretty much a white belt on the ground. He's shocking on the ground. And Perez obviously has a base in wrestling. He's a dangerous submission grappler, good offensive wrestler, good top game, total package on the ground. You know, if Perez comes into this fight with a grappling heavy game plan, he should dominate Kape. We're looking at 30-24 all day long. Won't be a contest. But Kape is aggressive. He hits hard. He's got no quit in him. He's game as fuck. He's opportunistic. He hits hard. And on the feet, you know, even though Perez has got good footwork, good movement, good boxing, nasty leg kicks, we know Kape is going to be walking him down, putting a lot of pressure on him, forcing him to fight in an uncomfortable range, looking to load up and catch him with big shots. And if you hurt Perez, it ain't hard to get him out of there. So it's a really strange matchup, which really hinges on the mentality of Perez. Remember, George St. Pierre famously said the fighting is 90% mental, and this fight's a great example of that, because skill for skill, Perez is a nightmare for Manel Kape. But if you ain't got the critical success factor, the most important aspect of this game, which is a strong mentality, you're not going to go very far. And that's been Perez's problem throughout his career, where, you know, he just can't build momentum because he caves too easily. He finds ways to lose. He struggles against these tougher, hungrier dogs like Manel Kape. So, like I say, Perez has got good footwork, good movement, you know, good leg kicks. He can hold his own with Kape on the feet, and he's got a massive advantage over Kape on the ground. The question is whether Perez can hang in there and keep his head together for long enough to make that count. So what I will do, I know that Kape is one of these like super hyped guys that loads of people think is very good, which is fair enough. But the only place you find truth and honesty in this game is the fight footage. So obviously I've been quite critical of Kape's takedown defense and ground game. Just want to highlight that so that you guys can see it with your own eyes, so that I don't get guys in the comments telling me that I'm a fool, because Kape is an amazing grappler, which I often hear, which is truly bemusing to me. But anyway, here we've got his last fight midway through the first round. You can see Dvorak under pressure on the outside, so in order to alleviate that pressure, gets the body lock, and you can see Kape just goes down so easily that he practically falls over. Now with 2 minutes 15 seconds left to go, you can see Dvorak in side control. And if we just skip through, you can see Kape is just very, very weak off his back. Very, very weak. Just kind of lies on his back, flat on his back, not really making any attempt to get back up to his feet. Dvorak actually decides to go into Kape's guard, which is interesting because side control is a stronger position. Anyway, Dvorak goes back to guard, and again, Kape, you know, makes no effort to get back up to his feet. He's not trying to create space for himself off his back. You know, he's not really trying to push off the hips of Dvorak and get to his knees. He's turning his hips in a little bit to attack with an armbar, but as you can see, very easy to hold Kape down. And Dvorak is kind of just stacking him and catching him with this ground and pound. As you can see, every time that Kape does create a little bit of space for himself off a submission attempt here, we can see he's rolling for a leg. Dvorak is able to just neutralize it and just re-establish a dominant position. Here you can see him working for half guard. So then at this point, with 50 seconds left to go in the round, Kape starts to attack with a Hail Mary Kimura, which is obviously extremely difficult to get from the bottom, particularly when you don't have control of your opponent's body to generate enough leverage to hit a reversal. I mean, all Dvorak really needs to do here is anchor his legs around Dvorak's legs, and Kape's not going to be able to reverse from this position, but Dvorak doesn't do that, and is really complacent in defending the Kimura, doesn't really address it, and as a result, you can see Kape is able to hit a reversal off it, which is not a very high probability. You don't have a very high probability success rate on hitting reversals with Kimuras off the bottom. It's very, very rare, and certainly not going to be easy for someone like Kape to hit a reversal like that on a strong grappler against Alex Perez when Perez is at his best. So that's just a little example there of how bad Kape's takedown defense and ground game is. But wait, there's more, because we never just want to single out one moment to make a point, because maybe Kape just got caught flat-footed and maybe he just had a moment of weakness on the ground. So we'll go to another one. Here is Mateus Nikolai, and we can see again the deficiencies that Kape has on the ground. So Nikolai shoots a double leg, drives him across the cage, and Kape better take down the fence this time, but he's not ready for the outside trip, which Nikolai gets easily and takes half guard. So with 3 minutes left in this round, and you can see again Kape just very, very weak off his back, very, very weak. And in this instance, Nikolai makes the mistake of, instead of trying to flatten Kape out and establish a dominant position, he gets overly aggressive and pulls guard on a guillotine, which enables Kape to escape that position. But again, you see Kape gives up another weak takedown here. Nikolai in on a single leg, and just look at how easily Kape goes down. It's so easy to upset his balance. And then 1:25 left to go in the round. Kape just kind of, again, weak off his back in guard. Just doesn't really know how to work his way back at his feet. It's quite easy to hold him down. So that kind of shows that Kape is going to struggle against anyone that is a semi-decent MMA grappler that uses a grappling heavy game plan. Perez is a pretty good MMA grappler. If he's got his head together, he uses a grappling heavy game plan, he should dominate Kape. But, like I said, GSP famously quoted as saying fighting is 90% mental. For all of Kape's technical weaknesses, he's game as fuck, tough as nails, no quitting him, with a strong will to win. He's hungry, he's mean, he's motivated, he's down for a scrap and up for a war. Perez often isn't. And in fights like that, in dynamics like that, irrespective of the skill for skill stylistic matchup, the tougher guy often finds a way to win. So, because of that, we've got another really difficult decision this weekend, because the more skilled fighter is the underdog, which often presents a good opportunity. But we've got exactly the same problem as we have with the Andrea Lee and the Macy Barber fight, where even though both Lee and Perez have good stylistic matchups in front of them, there are other weaknesses outside of their skill set, which makes it difficult to trust them. So again, Alex Perez is a really, really tempting bet this weekend, because at underdog odds, if he's motivated and he uses a grappling heavy game plan, he should absolutely dominate Manel Kape. It won't be a contest. But if he shows up and just caves like he did against Joey Benavidez, Kape's tough enough to give him a way out. So with everything I've just broken down, you'd have to be a lunatic to bet on Manel Kape, to the point where, Manel Kape is one of the worst bets this weekend, because if Perez shows up hungry, motivated, with a grappling heavy game plan, Kape has virtually no chance of winning. So you'd be crazy to bet Kape this weekend. The question though is, is Perez worth the gamble? And again, because it's such a complex fight with so many layers to it, I haven't decided yet. I just don't know. It's something I need to put more thought into, because with bets like Perez, with bets like Andrea Lee, with bets like Austin Lingo, the fighter has a pretty good chance of winning, but you also know you're putting your money in a lot of danger. My favourite kind of bet is where I'm not putting my money in that much danger and the odds are overwhelmingly stacked in my favour. That definitely isn't the case here. And as a result, I just don't know what I'm going to do yet. So again, you remember my community, I'll put out a Telegram if I decide to bet Perez. But it's tough, right? It's even tough to cherry pick, right? You don't want to cherry pick a bet on Alex Perez and pass on Lee and Lingo, and then Lee and Lingo win and Perez loses, and you hit the only loser out of the three you were leaning towards. Or, you don't want to bet all of them, maybe take a big loss. You don't want to pass on all of them, see all three of them win, right? It's tough. What do you do? What do you do? What do you do? It's very tough. Let me know in the comments below what you would do. I think if you've researched this fight, or if you've researched any of these fights, you'd agree with me that Perez, Lee, Lingo, and Duraev as well, they've all got great chances to win as underdogs, but can't pay the bills with value. So I feel like you can't really cherry pick betting any of them. You've kind of got to bet all of them or none of them. It's tricky, right? What do you do? What do you do? Let me know what you would do. Let me know what you're going to do. Let me know in the comments below. Maybe you can help me make my mind up. So in terms of the over-under on this one, I do think it's more likely the fight doesn't go to a decision because Perez has got a nasty submission game and Kape's bad on the ground. And Kape has got big power in his hands and Perez has been known to quit in fights when put in bad positions. Having said that, the odds on this are dreadful and I think the over gives you by far the better risk to reward ratio. I won't bet in myself because Perez is a giant flake box that I wouldn't trust to cross the road without getting run over by a car, but these odds don't get me excited on a fight to end inside the distance. So I would go with the over. If you really want to bet the over-under, go with the over. But you are putting your money in a lot of danger because of Perez's tendency to quit and how dangerous Manuel Kape is on the feet. So in terms of props on this one, it's tricky, man. Kape by knockout or TKO is off the table because the odds are too steep. Perez by decision's not bad. The odds are like 6.0 plus 500. I don't love it. I don't love it. It's not bad. The props are not that interesting to me on this fight. I would give them a miss. I'm not a fan of props anyway, as you guys know, but nothing particularly interesting to me there. Now let's break down the next fight on this card, which is going to be Albert Duraev against Chidi Njokuani. And just like the last fight we broke down between Alex Perez and Manuel Kape was a very clear-cut, easy one to predict in terms of possible outcomes, this fight is exactly the same. It doesn't help us lean confidently either way, but at least we know exactly what we're getting from these two on Saturday night. So if we start off by taking a look at the odds on this one, we can see that Chidi Njokuani is the favourite as quite a big odds spread. So we will say the favourite at average odds are about 1.61, which is going to be minus 164 for an implied probability of 62%. If we take a look at the odds on Duraev, he's around an average of, call it 2.35, which is going to be plus 135 for an implied probability of 43%. And we can see that Duraev is 34 years old, 5'11" with a 75-inch reach. And Chidi Njokuani, 34 years old, 6'3" with an 80-inch reach. So both guys the same age and different in terms of their height and reach. We know Chidi has got that long, tall, rangy body type with a 5-inch reach advantage, which is very notable in a matchup like this because Chidi is a very technical striker that knows how to use it, whereas Duraev, smaller, compact guy who will find it difficult to get inside on the feet against a guy like Njokuani. So this is a classic striker versus grappler matchup where if Duraev comes in with a grappling heavy game plan, he's likely to win pretty easily, whereas if the fight stays standing, Chidi is likely to win very easily because both these guys have extreme advantages in the area that the other is weak. Duraev is levels and levels and levels and levels and levels above Chidi on the ground, and I'm not going to say that amount of levels before, that amount of levels again, but Chidi is an equal number of levels above Duraev on the feet. And so this is one of those matchups where this is Duraev's fight to lose. This is one of those fights where it's really going to come down to what game plan and strategy Duraev chooses to use. If Duraev comes in with a grappling heavy game plan, Njokuani is absolutely screwed. But the bright side, the silver lining for Njokuani is that Duraev in recent fights, for whatever reason, probably to entertain Daddy Kadyrov, sat back home in his palace in Grozny, but for whatever reason Duraev has shown a reluctance to grapple, which is strange because that's his bread and butter. But at the end of the day, when a murderous dictator like Kadyrov is bankrolling your career and buying you nice sunglasses and nice cars, I guess, if Kadyrov wants you to stand and bang, you'll be his little bitch, you'll stand and bang, right? Better than getting fucking executed or poisoned, I suppose. So this is one of those fights where skill for skill, Duraev should dominate. However, he also should have dominated both Jacqueline Buckley and Roman Kopylov if he fought smart. But he didn't fight smart. And if he fights, or if he tries to fight Njokuani with the same game plan and strategy he used against Jacqueline Buckley, we will likely see a similar outcome where Duraev slows down in round 2, gets lit up bad on the feet, and stopped in devastating fashion by Njokuani. So, just like when we broke down the fight between Manel Kape and Alex Perez, I was very aware that Chidi Njokuani is a very hyped, very popular, very exciting fighter. So what I find is when I am critical of some aspects of a popular fighter's skill set, I face a lot of criticism myself. A lot of people in the comments will show up and be like, "You're clueless. Njokuani has amazing takedown defense. His ground game is phenomenal. You're way off, Chris." And I'm like, okay, friend. So what I really like to do is show footage to back up, certain things that I talk about, so that, it can't really be denied, right, if we're all looking at the same thing. So we know that Duraev is a strong offensive wrestler. He's got a base in combat sambo, good chain wrestling, heavy top game, good grappling control, very physically imposing style of grappling. Chidi Njokuani has a long, lean body type. And a lot of guys with long, lean body types have pretty bad takedown defense and are pretty weak off their back. Njokuani has very bad takedown defense. He's also very weak off his back. So we haven't seen a whole lot of Chidi's defensive wrestling and ground game in recent fights. A few of his recent opponents have taken him down with mixed success. Right, Rodriguez had a lot more success than Todorovic did. But ultimately, we haven't seen Chidi face anyone that used a grappling heavy game plan probably since John Salter all the way back in 2018, because even though Rodriguez got a stoppage against Chidi on the ground, there was also a fair bit of striking in that fight. So we don't really know where Chidi's takedown offense and ground game is at this stage in his career. What I can tell you for sure is that Chidi's takedown defense and ground game has improved. It's definitely improved. I'm going to show you some footage from his fight against Rafael Carvalho now from 2019, which is a very long time ago. And I can tell you his takedown defense and ground game's definitely improved. I know that by the way he moves in the clinch, by the way he defends himself on the ground. He's definitely got better. The question is whether he's improved enough since he fought Carvalho to neutralize the threat of grappling that someone with a ground game as formidable as Duraev brings to the table. Because there's a big difference between the level of grappling Duraev brings to the table and the level of grappling Rodriguez or Todorovic or Barrio or Carvalho or any of these other guys since he fought John Salter brings to the table. So this one's an interesting fight. What we'll do is just skim through the footage from this Bellator matchup against Carvalho. So we'll skip through and we will find some examples of Chidi's takedown defense and ground game, or should I say lack of. So what I don't want to dwell on this point too much, because this breakdown will end up being way longer than it needs to be, but keep an eye on the clock in the bottom left to see how much time is passing as I'm kind of explaining some of these points. So one big weakness that Chidi has had throughout his career is that he's very passive, very tentative, and doesn't show a whole lot of urgency to work his way through bad positions. So like Omar Morales last weekend in that third round, where he was just kind of on his knees, not making any effort to work through that position and get back up to his feet. And it was infuriating to watch because you could see Morales wasn't that tired and he knew how to escape that position. He just chose not to. Chidi is that guy. He also does it. He allows his opponent to hold him in positions for way too long without showing more urgency to work through that position. He's just infuriating. So as I'm skipping through the fight, pay close attention to how much time is moving with Chidi doing little to nothing. So anyway, here we can see first takedown attempt. Carvalho on the body lock just literally picks Chidi up, drags him to the ground. Chidi does a good job of popping right back up to his feet, but again, there's going to be a big difference between the grappling control of someone like Rafael Carvalho and the grappling control of a strong combat sambo guy like Duraev, right? You imagine Duraev with that body lock on Chidi's back. Not going to be as easy for him to pop back up to his feet. So then, right at the end of round 1, you can see Carvalho with the body lock. And at the business end of the round, he just hits an easy inside trip. So the majority of this round was standing, and that's mainly because Carvalho didn't fully commit to his takedowns. When he actually did fully commit, when he fully committed to that inside trip, when he fully committed to the body lock, he got Chidi down pretty easily. But outside of those takedowns he did commit to, there was just a whole lot of battling for position in the clinch where he wasn't actively working for a takedown, which is why a lot of that fight did take place in the clinch and on the feet. Now we're in round 2. You can see again, we're halfway through round 2 already, and both guys have just been in the clinch, achieving a whole lot of nothing. Finally, with 2 minutes left to go in the round, Carvalho decides to finally commit to a takedown. He gets in nice and deep on Chidi's hips, connects his hands together, generates enough time to yank Chidi's legs out from underneath him and drag him to the ground. And then Chidi, you can see, just in this closed guard position, similar to Manel Kape, just kind of lies on his back, doing absolutely nothing, making no attempt to get back up to his feet until the ref gets bored, stands him back up. But you could easily see Chidi staying on his back for another minute there, doing a whole lot of nothing. In round 3, do we have any more examples? Here's another example. So this time, again, Carvalho deep in on the legs of Chidi. And of course, what we know here is, in these positions, Chidi should be battling for underhooks. You know, there's so much time in here to fight for underhooks. I know there's not a lot of space in there, but if you just start fighting for the underhook, you can see that Carvalho doesn't really have the energy to quickly complete the double leg. He has to get his hands connected around your hips on the double leg, and then needs to actually drive through and complete it. In that moment, that's when you want to be fighting for underhooks. Try and generate any leverage you can to make it more difficult for Carvalho to complete the takedown. He just doesn't do anything. Like, what is Chidi doing here? He's doing absolutely nothing. And then Carvalho's energy bar goes back up, and he's got the energy to pick Chidi up and put him on the ground. 3.5 minutes left to go in the round. Again, Chidi just in closed guard, looking super weak, making no effort to get back up to his feet, and just looking absolutely dreadful off his back, really, until eventually, if we keep going, eventually Carvalho kind of postures up, which gives Chidi enough space on the bottom to just stand back up. Effectively, Carvalho just gets bored and lets Chidi back up. That's what happened there. So, and then right at the end of the round, he gives up another takedown. Or he doesn't. He actually pulls guard on a Kimura, which is an interesting choice. But yeah, anyway, as you can see, Chidi's takedown defense, ground game, very, very bad. So imagine what a combat sambo guy like Duraev could do to him. But Duraev, as we know, as we've seen in his fights against both Kopylov and Buckley, for whatever reason, he likes to stand and bang. You will see a bit of grappling from him. He always grapples a little bit, but for the most part, he likes to stand and bang. And if he tries to win a kickboxing match against a kickboxer as good as Chidi, Chidi's going to blast him on the feet, light him up with his powerful kicking game, get those boxing combinations going, and inflict a lot of damage to Duraev. Another thing to bear in mind, one of Njokuani's biggest weapons is his kicking game. He's got devastating body kicks, which will accelerate the rate at which Duraev gasses if Chidi starts going to the body early. So it's an easy stylistic fight for Duraev. You know, it's his fight to lose. But how easy this fight turns out to be for Duraev will depend on the game plan and strategy he uses. And time again, we've seen him try and strike instead of grapple. And if he does that against Chidi, it'll get him into a lot of trouble. So in a lot of ways, this fight is kind of similar to Alex Perez versus Manel Kape, where both Duraev and Perez have clear and obvious paths to victory this weekend, but it doesn't mean anything if they don't execute the correct game plan and strategy in order to maximize, you know, the advantages they've got on the ground. So what does that mean from a betting point of view? Well, there's a running theme of dog or pass situations on this card, right? Duraev is in a very similar position to Perez, Lee and Lingo, in that he's the underdog, he has clear paths to victory, but in order for Duraev to win, just like Perez, Lee and Lingo, the best version of him is going to have to show up with the best game plan and strategy. And he ain't the kind of guy you can trust to show up and use a good game plan and strategy. So needless to say, this is dog or pass. You would have to be a crazy person to bet Chidi Njokuani based on the footage I've just shown you, knowing combat sambo guys like Duraev are very well positioned to exploit Njokuani's weaknesses on the ground. You'd have to be insane to bet Njokuani, right? So this is clearly a dog or pass fight, but just know if you bet Duraev, he might not grapple, and if he doesn't grapple, he's screwed. And so if he doesn't grapple, if he wants to stand and bang and put on a show for Daddy Kadyrov, he's going to get lit up, probably knocked out, and he will then set fire to your money. So it's a tricky fight for betting, but obviously the Duraev gives you the better risk to reward ratio. Now, in terms of the over-under on this one, I choose my words carefully. I was going to say I quite like the over 1.5 rounds. That's because both guys are pretty tough. Njokuani has been known to quit. Duraev does gas. But I think they're both reasonably well-rounded enough to last 7.5 minutes in front of one another. So if you are going to bet the over-under on this one, go with the over 1.5 rounds. I'm probably not going to bet him myself purely because Njokuani is so dangerous on the feet and Duraev is so vulnerable on the feet, and Njokuani is so bad on the ground and Duraev is so dominant on the ground that I do feel you will be sweating this bet. But if you do want to bet an over-under, it's not terrible. I just don't love it. In terms of the props on this one, you know what? This is where we consult the records. So Duraev has gone 19 pro fights. What jumps out at me on a fight like this is Duraev to win by knockout or TKO odds at 8.0 plus 700. Not because I think Duraev will win by knockout or TKO, but because if Duraev wins with ground and pound, that would also be classified as a knockout or TKO. And we did see Njokuani kind of cave and get stopped on the ground with ground and pound in his last fight. Also happened when he fought Andrei Koreshkov. He just kind of gets to the point where he realizes he's outgunned on the ground. He can't defend himself. And so he's in a position where he either hangs in there for 3 rounds and takes tons of damage, or just waves the white flag, rolls over, plays dead, and gets stopped on the ground quickly. That's kind of what you see from Chidi. So he's been stopped with ground and pound twice in the past. So what I'm looking for on Duraev's record is how he tends to get finishes on the ground. Does he tend to get finishes with ground and pound or submission? And let's take a look. So we can see the submission. That one looks like it might be, I can't remember. It looks like it might be ground and pound maybe. Submission. So it looks like a lot of submissions. Oh, and punches, to be fair. It's a mixed bag, right? It's a mixed bag. There's some... there's one by punches there, which usually means ground and pound. Punches there. Punches there. A lot of submissions. What are the odds on submission? So Duraev by submission's a bit steeper. Yeah, so if you want to go for a prop on this one, I would go for Duraev by knockout or TKO on the basis that you could get a finish with ground and pound. 8.0 plus 700. Thank you very much, Governor. We'll have a bit of that. So anyway, I hope you found that useful, and I hope you do really well this weekend and make a lot of money. Don't forget, if you want to give yourself a better chance of making some cash this weekend, come join the live betting group. Like I say, there's no guarantees. You never know what will happen. However, I've made a profit pretty much every quarter since I started live betting UFC, and obviously the results are on my website to prove that. We've got a nice, strong, big community of people in the group. I think you'll like it. So if you want to get free access, send me an email address in the description below. First 5 people to email me are in this weekend, and I think it'll be a good event for live betting, so you might want to take advantage of that. I would highly recommend it.
Don't forget, if you want to watch breakdown videos for all the prelim fights on this card, head on over to my website, MMABettingTips.com. You'll find them all under pre-fight betting tips in this article here. You scroll down, still researching a few fights, but all the breakdowns will be in there. And yeah, like the video if you like it, leave a comment, I really appreciate that. Subscribe if you haven't already. Love you all. Enjoy the week off next week, and I'll be back soon with another breakdown video on YouTube shortly. Nice one, guys. Take care. Bye.